The story of convict transportation to Australia is often remembered as a single brutal episode in colonial history, a very dark moment marked by overcrowded ships, starvation, and disease. But this is only part of the truth. In practice, it was an ongoing event that evolved over 80 years, adapting slowly and painfully in response to both humanitarian concerns and also the practical needs of a growing colony. Early convict voyages to Australia were underpinned by the harsh conditions aboard now infamous vessels such as the Neptune and Britannia, these voyages ending with the deaths of up to a quarter of those embarked in the case of the Second Fleet, which dominate the research space due to their grim nature. What is often forgotten though is that the deaths of convicts aboard these ships and the arrival of prisoners in a sickly and unworkable state was in a direct detriment to the colony of New South Wales's future. For example, the Second Fleet's arrival in 1789 with so many injured and sick aboard led to an extreme food shortage in the infant colony of Port Jackson, and very nearly led to the colony's starvation if not for the 1791 arrival of the Third Fleet. Within the Second Fleet, vessels such as the Neptune, who mind you were under the command of a highly sadistic captain who was under contract, exhibited extremely high death and disease rates due to sheer brutality. Reverend Johnson described the scene of ships on arrival at Port Jackson as the misery I saw amongst them is undescribable. The Second Fleet was not, and it must be stressed, considered the norm when it comes to the exhibition of brutality on display. And when news reached the British public of the sadism displayed aboard these ships, there was an outcry. However, there was no legal consequences sought against those responsible for the near 25% mortality rate aboard, and Governor Phillip himself would lay the blame at the feet of the third-party contractors sought out by the British government to supply ships for transportation, stating that the vessels were simply far too overcrowded. The Third Fleet would also have a high death rate, although not comparable to that of the scale of the Second, and it became very clear during this early period that the death rate and the sickness on arrival rate of these fleets was simply not sustainable if the colony wanted to have a future. With the exception of the First Fleet's lower death toll of around 3%, convict voyages to New South Wales and the other surrounding colonies such as Victoria in those very early years of transportation had continued to exhibit high mortality rates. While these voyages would for the most part, wrecks excluded, reach the level of the Second Fleet, this was largely due to the nature of the ship's commanders and the surgeons, and not due to a concerted effort in the early days of transportation to improve conditions. Under British law in the 18th centuries, commanders of vessels at sea had dictatorial power as judge, jury, and if need be executioner. See, this was exhibited clearly during an incident on the voyage of Sir Francis Drake back in the 1500s, in which Drake executed Thomas Stoughty under the pretext of mutiny and disobedience during the Golden Hind's trip around the world. This position of extreme authority played a heavy part in high death tolls experienced aboard these vessels, such as that of the Neptune and Britannia. And Britannia, commanded by Captain Dennett, who by first-hand accounts had a highly sadistic approach to convict transportation and punishment, was no exception to this rule of I am the judge, jury, and executioner. Dennett, according to Charles Bateson, used his position as captain to dominate the head surgeon Augustus Bayer, confining the embarked convicts below and subjecting them to starvation, dehydration, and lashing, regardless of gender. There is one story about a woman aboard the Britannia begging for an orange only to be whipped to death because she dared speak out of turn. Although I'm not entirely sure if that one can be completely proven, given it's very he said, she said in that situation, but there are many other stories of Dennett just using the lash to whip people for the merest of crimes of daring to exist, so it wouldn't surprise me too much. As with the Second Fleet, the arrival of convicts in such a state was just a complete hindrance to the colony and not a benefit, leading to as time passed a concerted effort to improve the conditions aboard these vessels, including giving ship surgeons bonuses for the numbers of healthy prisoners landed. The timeline of transportation also crucially occurred during an era of discovery in terms of medicine and the improvement of health aboard vessels undertaking long sea voyages. Now, the history of penal transportation to Australia from 1788 to 1868 occurred simultaneously alongside tremendous leaps in shipbuilding. Earlier convict fleets, such as that of the First and Second Fleets, included many vessels that were highly unfit to make the voyage. And when these conditions were coupled with diseases such as scurvy, which is endemic to long sea voyages, the casualty rate grew immensely. Disease would remain a prevalent factor in these long voyages, and it will be examined further as we go along, However, a key factor in lowering the mortality rate on these voyages was the introduction of stricter regulations by the British government in 1815 on how convicts were to be treated at sea. Key parts of this legislation included marketed improvements in diet, which included the introduction of citrus such as lime to diets to combat scurvy. You have to remember at this time the term limey exists to insult the British, which is effectively because they have a lot of lime in their diet because they spend a lot of time at sea to get rid of scurvy. At the end of the day, turns out all you needed to do to combat half of these deaths was to just give people some vitamin C. The wonders of modern medicine. Alongside these medical improvements, the conditions aboard the vessels, and in many cases the vessels themselves, were also improved, with more space being given to the embarked convicts along with a reduction in the time spent in confinement below decks. These improved conditions, alongside the hiring of vessels that were in better condition for transportation when compared to older convict ships, saw a reduction in convict death rates from sea from an average of 5 to 10% to 2 to 3% by 1815. The older ships tended to be Indiaman designed or merchant designed, whereas the final convict ships arriving to Australia, such as the Hougoumont, which was the last ever ship to arrive, was of a similar build and design to large passenger vessels such as the Duncan Dunbar, a giant Blackwall frigate, which dwarfed these very old merchant ships which would carry the same amount of people. This vessel, the Hougoumont, while comparable in size to the Second Fleet's Neptune, carried 280 convicts, compared to the 433 aboard the Neptune, which was one of the largest convict ships sent in those early days. The evolution of ship design and regulations introduced by the British government significantly cut down the deaths aboard these convict vessels throughout the history of transportation, and this reduction ensured a steady flow of labour to the colony. However, disease still remained a factor for all these long voyages. And although Europeans by 1788 had been undertaking long sea voyages for centuries, prevalence of disease remained one of the most dangerous parts of a long journey at sea. The risk of infection compounds significantly when ships are overcrowded and transiting through tropical climates, with the disease of scurvy arguably being the biggest danger to human life. The prevalence of disease and scurvy at sea was not unique to convict transports though, with the Royal Navy being forced to implement policies to combat it throughout the introduction of lime juice, as I mentioned before, and other citruses starting in 1795. The introduction of anti-scurvy measures along with new instructions to cease convict ships from making port on their voyages assisted in curbing the death toll on board by the year 1800 to approximately 3 to 5%, as I mentioned. This drop in mortality was further compounded in 1815 onward with the introduction of those regulations, along with improving convict conditions. Now, these big regulation changes effectively gave the responsibility of power and sanitation over to the ship's surgeon instead of the appointed captains. Surgeons would now be on equal setting with captains when it came to crew and passenger health. And this was a massive difference to all of those on board. It broke with 400 years nearly of tradition as well. On top of that, the adoption of what was dubbed the Great Circle route also had an impact on disease, alongside the new positioned surgeons. The Great Circle route, it must be noted, you start in the UK, you make a straight run down the Atlantic, jump into the Roaring Forties, and then you go east, then north. It's a very simple course when you look at it on a map. Of course, it's a very long route and it would take months to do, but you avoid places like Rio de Janeiro, you avoid places like Dakar, you avoid places like Batavia, places that are hotbeds for disease at the time because they're, colonial outposts and the ports aren't the most clean, because they exist solely to load spices on ships. A key example of the ever-present risk of disease, though, it still remained, and one that we can look at is the convict ship Lord Lynock, which arrived in Port Jackson in 1838 with more than 150 infected with scurvy aboard. Similarly, in 1852, the immigrant ship Ticonderoga arrived in Port Phillip Bay with over 100 reported deaths due to typhus. What's really interesting during this period is we start to see a distinct difference between government-mandated ships such as the convict vessels and free agency ships such as that of Ticonderoga. In a really disturbing note, the death toll aboard ships that belonged to private companies that would bring free settlers to Australia would begin to experience far worse death rates due to the fact that paying passengers couldn't pay as much as the British government, and so they were stuffed aboard these immigrant ships with so few spaces aboard that disease would rip through them and absolutely destroy them. By the 1840s, you are more likely exponentially by significant factors to die on an immigrant ship than you were as a convict being transported for petty crime to the colony of Port Jackson. Although these ships are just two of hundreds of ships to arrive to Australia, the Ticonderoga and the Lord Lytnock, during this period, they are key examples of how disease on long sea voyages does not discriminate being a convict or a free settler. Disease to this day actually remains an ever-present issue when it comes to looking at ships at sea. Only take a look at COVID-19 and the effect of cruise ships during those early days of the pandemic, which would have effectively little clusters forming that would then infect and go on to infect small towns worths of people the moment the ships made port. The convicts transported between 1788 and 1868 were also predominantly men, and this is something that's often forgotten, is the experience of men and women during transportation is completely different. 15% of all transported convicts to Australia were female, and the experiences of female convicts through transportation are extremely different to that of males. Aboard transport vessels, male and female convicts were strictly segregated, with women carried either on entirely separate vessels or housed on different decks, apart from the men. And this is to prevent interaction, which, when I say interaction, you know what I mean. Guard arrangements also differed, with male prisoners heavily overseen by Marines and soldiers. Contrastingly, female-only vessels often had fewer or even no military guards, possibly reflecting assumptions about gendered risk and morality, but also to avoid any risk of mutiny by the guards who had begun relationships with female convicts, because that did absolutely happen. A key example of the contrast in how male and female convicts were treated occurred during the Second Fleet, where the mortality rate for men soared to around 24%, while female convicts suffered a far lower death rate at approximately 2%. Now granted, there are a lot more men than women on these transports, but the mortality rate is remarkably different. Those stark differences owed in part to the deliberate overcrowding, starvation and chaining of the men, whereas women, though exposed to sexual exploitation and coercion by the crew on this voyage, experienced less physically harsh treatment such as flogging. They were just mentally tormented the entire time. How nice of the captains. Socially, female convicts were perceived primarily as future domestic labourers within the colony of New South Wales, with many recruited to work as servants or laundresses, whereas male convicts were destined for physical and skilled labour in agriculture. There's also something to be said about the fact that there was a lack of... There's no real nice way to say this. There was a lack of wombs in early colonial history in Australia when it comes to men and women, and said lack of wombs would lead to women's lives being given a higher status than male lives. Not in the sense that women would have any rights, it would be in the sense that women were, well, they had a job to do, if you can catch what I'm saying in a YouTube-friendly term, whereas the male convicts, well, they were a bit more expendable. So, although both sexes enjoyed long journeys in harsh conditions, female convict voyages were characterised by enforced separation, lighter security, and ultimately this led to a lower mortality rate. This lower mortality rate, though, came with some distinct vulnerabilities in regards to that exploitation, and this contrasts significantly with male experience on voyages, which emphasise control, oversight, and punishment. Both experiences, though, did notice a significant decrease in mortality and sickness rates with the introduction of the changing policies as time went on, particularly when surgeons started to become more powerful. It actually had a remarkable impact on the health of women on these voyages that was significantly different and significantly can be observed. By the time the last convict stepped off the Hougoumont, the transportation system bore little resemblance to its violent beginnings. It had become in many ways a machine, better built, better run, and far more successful than what it set out to do, deliver human labour alive to the edges of empire. And that was the thing about the convict transportation system that people don't understand. Its very existence ended it. The fact that it kept giving so many people to Australia that would then have a chance to have a better life led directly to its ending. Because as those settlers came after the convicts had already built the place, and as the convicts became free and built the place themselves, there was no need for more people. They'd already built their home, and so the thought of more convicts coming, well, it just wasn't necessary anymore, and it was actually started to be looked upon with a bit of shame. It is interesting how In Australia, our evolution as an identity has evolved from one of shame at our convict past to one now where we stand up at sporting events, and when the English call us a convict, we usually swear at them and say, "Hell yeah, I am." But that's just a quick video on how the convict system and transportation evolved over time. And I know it's very, very niche, but hey, it's the lesser of two evils and I can do what I want when it comes to Age of Sail. So thank you, like, comment, subscribe, stick around, because as you all know, you must always in the service choose the lesser of two evils.